we look at the past, I would hope we can get inspired by looking at the craftsmanship and looking at the details and long to build better because we see beautiful things like this. All right, so studying woodworking and joinery in this period. Has anybody been to Sturbridge Village? You've really traveled. You always raising your hand. That's good. So they have a water powered sawmill there. And so sawmills in New England were actually fairly common fairly early, even into the 1600s, that they had configured. And when I watched this thing cut, it's pretty fascinating. Basically, you have a big water wheel, and this saw goes up and down, and it lurches forward, kind of cuts forward as this saw moves through it, and it's cutting boards in kind of 1 inches and 2 inch thicknesses. So think about them when they're, we think about 2x4s, 1x4s, all those things. That started because these guys are basically cutting boards into lengths that can dry, okay? So these are wet logs, they cut through them, then they have to dry for sometimes a year, sometimes 2 seasons. And so getting wood was not just a matter of going out to the forest and cutting wood, but letting it dry for a long period of time. And so watching these things work, this is how things would have been cut in New England. In the South, they had pit saws. And of course, a pit saw is a saw where one guy's in a pit. And you set a log up, one guy climbs down into a hole, and they sit there and they saw, and one guy's getting rained on with all the sawdust, and the boss is on top, right? But when I was at North Bennett Street, we would actually look at how those logs were sawed to know that they are pit sawn or know if they came from a mill. And then later with circular saws, because that isn't an invention until later in the industrial period, how things were sawed. And so it's very important. We're kind of going to go through all this stuff. Shops were small, okay? This is the Dominy shop at Winter Tour. Have you been to Winter Tour? Yes, of course you have. Do you want to teach this thing? No. Yeah. Okay, the Dominy shop is basically this shop that they discovered in the 1940s. 3 generations of families had gone in this shop. And it's very small, right? You can see that this small thing. They were cabinet makers, furniture makers, clock makers. They did joinery, 3 generations. The first guy was a cabinet or a furniture maker, and in like 1780, is that right? Well, basically, ready-made furniture became a thing, and he kind of lost his job. Then another guy was a clock maker for a long time, but then mantle clocks became a thing, and he kind of lost his job. And the last son was a joiner. But they kept this same shop over time, and they have basically they basically found this thing. It's kind of mothballed. It's a little bit like Pompeii, right? Where they found this shop. Thousands of tools, and it's just this excellent example of what a shop looked like during this period. Notice there's not really any machinery. This is a lathe that's coming from a wheel, so it was a hand-powered lathe that they used. So they stopped in about 1840, 1850, so right before industrialization. So everything was handmade, and if you look back at Diderot, his study of the trades in the 18th century, this isn't too far away from how shops were, right? Having this kind of shop wasn't even a thing, right? Most shops were very small, probably as big as this office right in here, right? 22 by 12 by 15. There would be a bench. This was these is French, and so this would be a big production shop. But in America, you might have even these things outdoors. If you've been to Colonial Williamsburg, have you been there? If you go there, you'll see outdoor sheds, outdoor shops, indoor things. They're very small. That's how woodworking and how building happened when they were making things like this. When you were building things, this is the Gidley room at Winter Tour. Notice the back of these boards, right? They didn't bother spending time, roughing down the back side of the board, which still has, right? This would have been made in a sawmill. pit saw, and you'd see those saw blades go back because the guys are doing this, and then he stands up and does this, right? And so those saw blade marks are different, but that's very uniform. So most likely that came from a sawmill, water-powered sawmill. But the front side's obviously beautiful, well crafted, well made. The back side is all rough lumber, right? That they wouldn't spend the time. We don't think about, when we have planers and joiners and things, we run things through there. We're always making 4 smooth sides, right? They never did that. When they're making things like this, they are there is in this kind of arrangement, right? Georgian versus Federal, it's a different set of moldings, a different set of way of how they're going to approach things. There's a ton of carving in here. Now this is William Buckland. He was a carver and he was trained so this could get laid out like this. This is much different. These are more moldings, and then some of these moldings might be applied. We know that Samuel McIntyre carved them, but we begin to get in the era in the 1800s where the specialization of craft with builders means that you're buying your sash from the sash maker. You're buying your doors from a door maker. You're not making everything by hand. It begins to get a little bit modernized here, and you would, just like Samuel McIntyre would sub himself out as a carver, you were hiring those things out. Just looking at a Georgian room, okay, this is the Port Royal, this is 1760s at Winter Tour. I mean, the beefy nature of these moldings, right? They're huge. This molding here sticks out from the wall, and that casing 3 inches, right? 3 inches. I mean, that is a massive molding, right? And so these moldings would have been made with what's called hollows and rounds, and we'll get into that. This is a Federal room, okay? And, the change here is, this change in this crown, of course, has this fluted top here. The moldings are much more refined, much simpler. Notice the shape of the moldings. One of the things that happens during the Federal period is we change from this round-based moldings to an elliptical-based molding. And so this shape, and then, in here especially, is egg-shaped, right? It reflects light differently. It isn't as bold and heavy. Look what's happening to this cornice. This is kind of a typical difference between the Georgian and the Federal. Because they're looking at Palladian books in the 1780s and looking at how that stuff's done, it's very canonical. This is a 45-degree angle from top to bottom. In the Georgian period, they become much more expressive. They see these moldings flow out onto the wall. This is more like a 60-degree angle. And so moldings begin to express themselves very differently. The size of the moldings change. I told you that this architrave sits out from the wall 3 inches. This is like 1.5 inches, right? This molding, these architraves are huge. They're 6-7 inches wide. These come down to kind of more relative sizes, 4 inches, 5 inches. You begin to see, this is a line we did for Kukin, the differences in these moldings and in these shapes. This is a Georgian molding, right? And this is a Federal molding. I don't know if you can see that, but the reason this this projects out, right? And this is cut away. Do you see that? So in the Federal period, you would have removing of wood, which would reflect light differently. The Georgian moldings are very round and projecting, right? And so I can walk up and go, yeah, that's a Georgian molding now. It's a Federal molding just by looking at those shapes, the size, its massiveness, and things like that. Moldings were made either with custom planes like this, right? This is a crown molding here, right? This is the kind of tools. These tools are very finicky, okay? Obviously, if you get a lot of humidity, you got a lot of different stuff, you've got different, they're hard to use. Basically, what's happening is there's a wood wedge, which is right here, and a metal blade, okay? Right? And so it's pretty crude, right? It's just this piece of metal with this cut and this shape, and you are wedging your blade in here. And so I'm looking like this. I'm pushing that knife up in there just enough so that I can, it's going to catch some wood, right? and then I'm pushing my wedge down in here, right, and hoping it doesn't move, right? It just did. And then there's little bumps you'll do on the back side to loosen it up or pop it down a little bit. They're very finicky tools, is the point. And then you have these moldings, and oftentimes there was a line, right? I don't know if you can see that, but there's a line back here to show you where level is. And so sometimes I would approach a board, and I might approach a board like this, because that's the way that knife is going to work through that board, right? None of this, you know, the way a knife would hit today, because the way we're cutting it with these metal blades, it's very different. And then you might have custom planes like this, which is a sash blade, right? That's for making sashes. And these would be custom, all of these would be custom, but that would be something very specific. The other way to do it is what's called with hollows and rounds. And basically, hollows and rounds would you buy a set. Normally there were 16. And they were all based on a different radius. And so you see these different radiuses here. They're paired by their radiuses. And if I wanted to cut this shape right here, I'd find out what radius that is. I would get this blade and I would cut it through here. And when I want to, you know, cut that, I get it down here. And so you can make custom moldings with this thing, right? This was your custom molding kit and how you would make moldings. The other thing is that if we look back at that, the book on the Philadelphia Carpenters Company, and they had these price lists, okay? And these were for door jambs and window jambs, okay? There's a window jamb with a track, right? Well, you notice that there's these little beads on here, and there's this little rabbet, okay? What's going on is basically the rabbet, okay, here and here is for a door. And so what you would do is you would actually frame your walls, okay, with, you know, these studs, and you'd put a bead and a rabbet on your stud, okay? The plaster would come in here and die behind it, and then oftentimes moldings were covering that gap, okay? And so our shape that we end up with today like this is really a combination of that bead and then this cap, because we don't do this the same way today, right? And so they are, one of the shapes we end up with, one of these things we end up with is because of the tectonics of how this is being built, right? And this would have been a 1-inch door, right? And so there's different scales here, but that's what's going on here when, you know, they're actually making the back band there, what we call a back band there, into the frame, and then they would die the plaster up against that. So different ways of building, and the moldings that we use today sometimes come from weird places. If we were making this, right, today, you know, this would be, there's that bead maybe on the frame, right? And then this might be your molding back here, okay? And you might have this shape, this back band shape if you use it a lot, and you might have this shape, right? So you would begin to collect, you know, these shapes that you would use more often. Sometimes you'll still see those shapes over here. Sometimes, you know, you figure it's, you know, 1760, 1770, and then by 1790, you're using a completely different set of moldings, okay? So maybe that's normal, maybe that's not a big deal. I always kind of felt bad for the guys that had this great set of tools and then the styles change. It's not like for us today where our tools are more disposable. This would have been made with a little hollowing or a little gouge that would have been planed, and so, you know, all these would have been separate moldings that would have been applied. These carving pieces would have been made, pre-cut, and then a carver would have come in and carved them. So anyway, each different molding is made specifically and differently like that. And then as far as carving goes, there's one thing I've learned by having Vossel here. This master carver is learning how to look at moldings very differently. And so this is an early Samuel McIntyre carving. And basically what he's done is that, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's not very good dart there, okay? And so if you look at an egg and dart like this, that molding is basically, it's a classical molding that, it's a classical molding that, and it's based on this kind of idea that if there's an egg here, there's a dart, okay, and then there's an egg and a dart. And it's kind of life and death, that the egg is this new life and this dart is death. And so there are different ways of carving this and doing this. And so what I've learned in watching is that there's good egg and darts and there's bad egg and darts. And so what happens is on the good ones is that they are carefully laid out so that, where's my example? Oh, put it over here. Wherever there's a corner, okay, there's a leaf, okay? And so that there isn't this, okay, where someone's made a long sheet of egg and dart and then they just cut it on a 45 at some point and hope it kind of comes together all right. But the right ones would actually make this out so that there's a leaf here and a leaf here, kind of like in this little corner here. And so that this would all have to be carefully laid out so that, and if you'll notice it this way, this egg lines up with the middle of that bead, this egg lines up here. And so all of a sudden it ends up being very carefully laid out, very carefully constructed. And when you get a whole bay of these things laid up together and you see them done well, all of a sudden there's this orchestra of shapes and details that are all speaking to one another, and it's really quite wonderful. We actually, to make this, we were copying this and looking at the past, laying out these leaves and everything else so that it looks right. When you look at something like this, this is an incredible house in Salem, in Charleston. Their leaf and their corner detail is even more expressive, okay? Their egg and dart is richer and fuller. If you look at this one here, copied this one too. We're great copiers. It's not even a dart detail, it's a little bud detail. So there's this little leaf coming down and opening up, kind of looking like a dart, but having more of a leaf detail. And so all of a sudden, you realize that there's many different ways to express this and many different ways to do this, and you can pass these around, that are really beautiful and wonderful. Now, when you compare those to what you can get at Home Depot, it's not really fair. And so, but sometimes I feel like we've forgotten how carefully these things were crafted and how carefully these things were done, and we end up looking silly today and forgetting that these were handcrafted and handmade. The other thing that you'll see, and we've made some Federal moldings, and so in the Federal period, we talk about the dainty detail in here. These were just some we worked up for a client, but this is, these are very Federal shapes, right? You see that egg shape right there, and these are pretty moldings too. And so when you just look at these things, right, almost no dart, no planning there versus this kind of thing, or how expressive these are and how deep and rich these are, there you can see that little bud detail that's so pretty. It ends up being pretty magical. So composition moldings in this Federal period kind of look like this, right? There was 2 or 3 guys, I was just reading this great article at the University of Chicago about George Andrews, or is it George Andrews? Yeah, George Andrews, Robert Welford. They were kind of the more famous. They had catalogs of moldings that they made. These are composition moldings today that like Decorator Supply uses, is a combination like molasses and animal hide glue and sawdust. Okay, back then it was partly plaster, like lime, like whiting. It's a little bit of resin in there. And so there's been a little bit different composition, but they're made the same way in that someone would carve this little detail into a wood or metal, shape. And then what they do is they take their very fine compo molding and shove it in there and press it in there. It would dry, they'd drop it out of the mold, and they can make them over and over and over again. And so a Federal molding when it's like this is less expensive than a Georgian molding when it's hand carved, going back to your question. But the compo moldings, there's, Decorator Supply is still the place to get them. They do a wonderful job. They have original molds and original details. But that's how this would have been made. And this really starts because Robert Adam saw that stuff in Pompeii, goes back and redesigns how we decorate a room. And so these moldings end up being very faint. I mean, if you look at that chair rail, they're not real heavy and thick. They're very faint and dainty. And so that's kind of how that Federal molding looks. But compo really starts at this period. And some people will say, well, that's not historic. Actually, it's very historic. It's not a Victorian thing. Okay, it got picked up in the Queen Anne area, kind of overblown again. But it's very historic going back to the 1780s, early Federal period. And then you can see this kind of stuff here, all of this shape in here. And so Federal to me is very easy to pick out because there's common themes, especially in America. And you realize there's only 2 or 3 guys in the country that had a catalog that were showing this off. Everybody's basically buying from the same catalog. So you see the same things over and over again. There's a very famous one, the Battle of Lake Erie, which was the famous one that would be right in the middle of a mantle, and I've seen it 20 times. This kind of swag detail is pretty typical, and so very, very easy to pick out. This is a George Andrews. Again, we see the swag. Sometimes another one that's very popular would be Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. Those would be some on either side of it. But see what they've done? They've exaggerated the frieze, right? So they got the very small architrave. They've got a cornice that's compacted, and the proportions are still good, but now they've got this big frieze in there, and they've got these swags going across there, and that's where the decoration goes. Same thing in this mantle, exact same thing, right? And then same thing over top there. These columns are very small and refined. Sometimes you'll see those, they're there on that mantelpiece too. But this is prototypical Federal. Notice too, there's not paneled walls, right? Very simple moldings, just a chair rail, very simple cornice, just not very heavy, okay? Remember, we're now discovered what the inside of these buildings really look like, so we're no longer using exterior moldings.